All right. Hello and welcome to Modest Conversations 8.0 or Builder Conversations. I'm here with Eran, Shir, who's the CEO and founder of Nexar. And a few years ago, you and I did a great little podcast, which I really enjoyed. I think you had just come back from a conference on the future of cities and had some really
Right.
interesting viewpoints on kind of what was going on with transportation in cities and things like that. What a different era we're now in, the COVID era.
Oh my God.
We're like, who would have predicted? But yeah, I'm really excited to be talking with you again. I mean, your company is obviously super fascinating, and just for disclosure, Disclose is obviously an investor, and we're very excited about kind of your day-to-day job. But I also just love to hear your bigger picture viewpoints on what the hell is going on with transportation. And I'm really curious to kind of update our old conversation, which is how your viewpoints have changed, if at all,
Yeah.
in the last few years. Remembering back to that great chat you and I had. So I don't know. So Eran, tell us what's going on. What is the future of transportation? What are the big themes? Are we still going underground? Is everyone going to go to the hills? What's the deal?
Well, I think that you guys are experiencing a phenomena that I'm kind of tracking quite curiously, and you can see it in the background of of the backdrop of where you are. It doesn't look like your San Francisco apartment, and I would bet it's somewhere more rural than the mission, and I think that I've kind of tracked that kind of trend in quite interestingly in the last I guess six months, as people kind of are waking up to a situation where many of them, not all of them, but many of them have actually more new gained freedom of choosing where to be, and some of the theories that have controlled us for, I would say, millennia, for the better part of the last 10,000 years, which is, density is good. Cities, larger cities are more productive than smaller cities. So you want to, huddle into larger cities. Your GDP grows, your opportunities grow, all of this kind of stuff. We all of a sudden are starting to see sort of a bit of rethinking of it. Now, I do not know if this is a 2020 phenomena or this will actually have a lasting effect. I can tell you that I, for example, spent the last month in Greece, in the Greek islands, not on vacation. I was walking throughout that time, but there was, I don't know if you know, but there was quarantine in Israel. So a few days before quarantine, I told my wife, fuck that. We're not gonna stay here for quarantine. Let's go and spend some time in the Greek islands. And we were planning on going for like 10 days, and then it ended up being a month. Every villa or every house that we went to, I asked the owner to send me speed test screenshots before we got there, because that was the only thing that mattered, was internet. But beyond that, I continued managing the company. I continued being in touch with my friends, all of that. My kids continued studying in school. So it's a very interesting kind of shock to the system, which I don't know yet if it will last, if people that will have seen the light will have new habits, or it will kind of move back to where it was. I do have some hunches there, but that's the most interesting kind of.
Yeah, so I'm curious, just to jump in for a second on a few things. First, your company obviously has a ton of data about this. Like, are you actually what is actually happening in the San Francisco Bay Area? How does that compare to what's happening globally, et cetera, in terms of like the actual meta impact of some of the trends you're seeing around traffic and where people are commuting and things like that?
Yeah, so actually when COVID started, we started tracking that and actually started publishing a report every few weeks called the Nexar Mobility Report. So that's a shameless plug to go and find that on Twitter or wherever. And what we've done is we tracked every state mobility index, how much people are driving every few weeks. And we've seen some fascinating phenomena there that you can actually see now because it's now historical. If you compare, for example, New York and Ohio, two states not that far away from one another, totally different impact of COVID, right? New York transportation mobility kind of went through the floor. It really dropped dead on an instant, and it took it months and months to recover, and it still didn't recover. If you look at New York mobility at this moment, mobility index at this moment, it still didn't recover to 100%. Or even close to 100% of what it was.
And is it asymptoting? Like, do you think it'll ever recover? Or like, ever is a long word, but is there enough people who have just said, I'm out of here? Like, can you tell that from your data, or is it not? You're not sure?
Well, it's hard for us to say things definitive about the future because you don't know how many people are still kind of in holding pattern in the Hamptons or in Maine or whatever. I can tell you, for example, one of my product managers that lives in New York spent the last 7 months back in his family's house in Maine, and just this week he came back to New York. So this is a sort of a prolonged process to going back into the cities, and it's not going to be without its hitches because COVID is a sneaky bastard. So it won't, especially when you don't have good management. So what will happen is you're going to continue to see surges, and they will slow things up and slow it down, and then people will think of going back, but then they'll see the surge, and then they'll rethink it. So it's going to be a bumpy road, I think, for the next at least 6 months. But if I go back to Ohio, because I didn't finish that point, yeah. Ohio, on the other hand, was totally like a V-shaped state. It had a bump that wasn't that big, and then it immediately bounced back from perspective of mobility and people moving to 100%. Immediately within a span of, I think, 4 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that, people went back to the same levels. So that was one thing that was quite curious, and you can see all the kind of states in between. The other thing that we've done, which was interesting, was tracking how many people are wearing masks in the public space. I guess I'm not supposed to spill too many beans here because I think VP Marketing wants to make a story out of it, but we're in small gatherings, so I myself. So kind of basically detected, tracked the behavior of people. How many, what is the percentage of people in places, from Houston to Miami to New York? What's the probability that people will actually wear masks? And you see there also that there is variation between different states. This is not surprising given everything that's going on in the US, but it's quite interesting in the sense that you think you live in a country in the United States. Actually, my message to you is you don't live in a country. You're living in a certain state that is actually quite different from other places. Not that you need me for that. You need an Israeli from Tel Aviv to tell you that. I think you know it better. But that's just what we see.
So talk more about what you think this means long term. Like, I mean, again, there's been always this question of, will technology make cities more vibrant and like basically centralize us or decentralize us? And I remember this in the 90s, not a new conversation. My dad was very into I don't need to go to an office anymore. I can telecommute everywhere. I want to live in the most beautiful places, right? I think he turned out to be wrong in his era, right? Which is that if anything, what technology really did was made cities even more vibrant because it was easier to find what's going on in them. The transportation or mobility was so easy became much easier on cities. So actually city life became better because of Internet 1.0. right? With internet
Yeah.
2.0, I guess the jury was out. There were arguments in both cases. COVID has tipped us in a certain way. So it's amazing. I mean, this is obviously a silly anecdote, but Jackson Hole real estate, incredibly beautiful place, in the last few months is out of control, right? Because it turns out that everyone's like, yep, I'm going to move to Jackson Hole, right? Like, you know, it's not about Austin. Like, Austin's fine, but it's not that great. I mean, it's not that beautiful, right? But like the most beautiful places in the world are not becoming hyper pressurized because, you know, when you can work from anywhere, all of a sudden they're the best place to be, right? Or for a lot of people. So I guess the question in my mind is, when you think about what that means for transportation, mobility, how people look at things, like, I don't know, what are your kind of big level insights about what's going to happen? Is it going to, you know, demographically, you know, culturally, and then, you know, obviously the technology around it?
So I'll tell you what I think about it. I was walking around for the last 20 years with a thesis about the world, focused on, you know, complex systems and complex networks and the importance of networks, of physical networks, in pretty much any human activity. Okay, that's what I done in my research back in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003. And until 2006, and that's what I kind of believed that along the way. I think Jeffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute kind of summarized it, you know, my thesis, the thesis I believe in, very well in his book Scale, and kind of some of it I learned from him, some of it I kind of seen in my own research. And that actually governed my management style also, because what you see is when you have complex networks and this kind of self emerging phenomena like you have in cities, especially dense cities, you see everything works to their benefit. You see GDP growth, you see opportunity growth, you see life quality, any parameter that you have measured, you know, over the decades and decades. Bigger cities were better, maybe except for you know, smog in LA or something like that. But bigger cities were better than suburbs, who were better than rural areas. That was a given. And what we're seeing is an awakening from that, or a question mark. This exclamation mark that was there all these years is now becoming a question mark. And some people are early adopters, and they're obviously fucking Jackson Hole. But guess what? Jackson Hole doesn't have space for everyone that lives in LA. Okay, so you have some physical kind of challenges in trying to do that. So so the prices will go and things will kind of even out, but then you're optimizing for where can I get good infrastructure that's the most beautiful, most kind of relaxing, or what most kind of lifestyle option. So they have this kind of multi factor optimization problem. But the question that is still, the reason why I think the jury is out is because we are social animals, and it is really non-obvious that you can replicate a lot of what makes us happy in a place like Jackson Hole or Truckee or something like that. For many, many people, how many opera houses are there, and how many restaurants, and how many this and how many that, you know? So I think that we're kind of, the pendulum is kind of jumping very fast into a certain direction, because people say, okay, now I'm free. I can kind of have my fantasies like someone turning 21 in the US, and then going to a bar and kind of drinks all night, right? He's not going to drink all night every day from now on, but he's in this rush of opportunity, and I think to a large extent many people are. I'm not sure that that's that trivial. If we can go back to our conversation from a few years ago, one point there that I can kind of connect is, if you remember, I think we talked about also autonomous vehicles and their impact on like second degree impacts. And one of the things that interested me the most on autonomous vehicles, even though they're still far away, is their impact on real estate. And the notion was that if you don't have to commute yourself, you don't have to drive yourself, the circle of commute just grew up because you can sleep on your way to work, you can watch a movie, you can be productive, you can hang out with friends, you can see all of this kind of stuff. All of a sudden, you don't have to cram into Manhattan because the agony element has been stripped away, right? And that is something that we feel pretty certain that when autonomous vehicles will happen, that will still take time. I think quite a lot of time, but when it will happen, that effect is just makes sense. It's something that
Sure. I mean,
that will make
look,
sense.
the relationship between new forms of transportation and the monetization or changes around real estate are long-standing. I actually, hilariously, I don't know him well, but many years ago in the early days of Uber, pitched Travis that he really needed to start a real estate fund and that Uber was really a real estate company because all these neighborhoods that used to be inaccessible all of a sudden become valuable, and you could model that and start investing in real estate, much like the railroads did. I mean, if you think about how railroads made money, railroads didn't make money from the railroad. Railroads made money from land grants, right? Where they kind of split the land grants, and that's kind of how they ultimately monetized their transportation technology. So I fundamentally agree with you on that. I guess going back to this conversation though is like, let me throw another kind of direction in, which I think is how I'm trying to think it through, which is, do you remember like 10, 20 years ago, there was this big debate between the airlines about long haul flights versus regional flights? And there was this question, some airlines, at least in the US, pursued this regional model, lots of little regional jets between cities, et cetera. And then the others had kind of like this hub and spoke model, right? Where they said, okay, we're going to do big hauls and then lots of little, and then like, kind of, and so the question was like, would you have an airline model that was hub and spoke based or lots of point to point regional, right? And, I would argue
Southwest versus United.
Sure. Right. And they're both valid questions. And people are investing in different technologies and different routes, with these two very different theses in mind. I guess that's my question when it comes to where people live and how it impacts transport. Like, I'm with you. One version of the world is the exurbs model, right? Which says like, okay, with self-driving cars, maybe you actually still do cluster around megapolises, huge cities, but you just go further away from the center because you don't need to commute every day. The other model I'll call the Jackson Hole model, which is you say, no, or maybe not Jackson Hole, but like the tier 2 city model, which says, look, in a world of great information, I still want infrastructure close. So I still want to be an A city. It just doesn't need to be as big a city. And so if there's a higher quality of life in kind of a tier 2 city, that works. But they're kind of different models, right? I'd actually argue maybe the Jackson Hole model might be more of the megapolis model, because I think people moving there, and again, it was a very silly group of people, but that segment of the population as an extreme, they're not like, I'm never going to go to a city. They're basically saying, look, I can spend a lot of my time in Jackson Hole, and when I want the opera, I'll just fly to Denver or fly to San Francisco or whatever, right? And so I guess the question in my mind is like, any thoughts on how those two options play out and those other?
So there's actually quite a few thoughts that goes through my mind as you describe this. I think that there's a real question. I think maybe the biggest question has to do with city planning and architecture, because if what is happening now in some places of the world and in some cities also in the US is that for the first time in a century, we are taking back the streets. What I mean by that is that the streets were owned by cars for the last century, right? If you watch the New York City movies from the beginning of the 20th century, and you kind of compare it when everyone are walking in the middle of the road, and you kind of compare it to what you're accustomed, you're like, oh my God, this is very different. or the San Francisco ones. There are some beautiful San Francisco kind of turn of a century films, and the behavior and the life of people is quite different. And what we're seeing now in Europe, for example, but also in places like New York and some other places, that because of COVID, because of different things, we are taking back that space, and we are kind of pushing the space that we allowed for vehicles to get smaller and smaller, and that changes I think in a fundamental way, the architecture of the city, and that can turn mobility into the city life into something that is much more similar, much more kind of akin to smaller city lifestyle, right? If all the restaurants are out and if everyone are biking around and electric bikes are the big thing, then you might look at cities, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, and you say, okay, we woke up from this nightmare of basically owned by the car, and now we're going back to a life that are more sprawled, like cities that are more sprawled, that allow us to take that lifestyle that you are craving for. When you go to that smaller city, what are you craving for, right? You're craving for a certain lifestyle that the big city doesn't give you, because it is owned by, to a large extent, because it is owned by these transportation modes and parking lots and all this kind of stuff. So that for me is probably one of the more interesting questions of how this will play out.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I get that. Interesting. So I guess, what do you think is like, let's pretend we all just go back to normal. Tell me the story of us all going back to normal, where we're just wrong. Like, we actually, the megaopolis city story is right. It still dominates the kind of go anywhere story. Is it what you're saying, which is we take back the streets and it just becomes so much more compelling yet again to live in cities that like no one wants to live out in the middle of nowhere? I mean, I'm just trying to play the counterfactual of like, what will we have to, for COVID we look back upon as not important, what would have to happen?
So I think at the end of the day, it won't be about businesses, it will be about social trends. Because honestly, businesses have adapted quite well to COVID lifestyle, right? Like many businesses, both in tech, but not only in tech, like across the board, lots of businesses kind of realize that they can work remote, that actually they can be more efficient sometimes remote. The whole bubble of business travel burst. Everyone understood that business travel is a big kind of bubble. It's really not needed to a large extent.
Hey, you're talking to someone who hasn't done real business travel in like ever. I think I've had my whole career. If I had to guess, my entire career, I've gone on under 20 business trips.
Well, yes,
so
but you're not an investment banker.
Curve. What?
You are ahead of the curve, but you're also not an investment banker or a salesperson, right?
Correct.
So it is the interesting thing is people kind of wake up and say, okay, I can do sales. Actually, guess what? I can do more sales. I'll give you an example. Last week, my team, I think, participated in 3 conferences in a week. It was never heard of before. Now, granted, virtual conferences are really not a replacement yet to real conferences. So we still, there's a lot of opportunity. There's lots of stuff to build, but we've been doing sales and business development without missing a beat, and actually, and I think many businesses. So I think if things will go back to normal, it won't be because businesses will push it, because there's a productivity gap and they need to. it will be because people are lonely, you know? I was in the office today, and now I go like once a week or twice a week to the office, mainly when I want to meet someone face to face for some reason. But there are people that frequent our office every day. It's open, and there are some people. And I talked to one of my guys today about it. He said, "Look, I come every day because I just can't handle it staying at home, and I can't handle it with my kids. I can't handle the I can't concentrate well. I need to get out." Okay, and I hear that multiple times, and we've actually acted on it as a company, as Nexar. We've actually built all kind and many other companies, I'm sure, have done this kind of stuff. We started all kind of social clubs. I started learning to draw in one of those clubs. It's really funny at my age. But we've done all kinds of activities to keep people engaged in social, because that is a need that any anthropologist or animals researcher will tell you that. Those famous research projects on you leave an animal, a gorilla alone, and he dies from loneliness and all this kind of stuff. We are a social animal, and the question, and that's why I'm kind of not sure about whether it continue that track, is how much of that can you replicate into a virtual scene. Okay, and I think that at the end of the day will be the defining factor. That's also the opportunity for startups, and if you manage to replicate that well, then people will flock to that, because that will be something they crave.
I hear you, but can I be a little more cynical for a second? Which is, sure. I think that's historically true, right? And we are social beings, and we get a lot of pleasure and joy from that, and that is kind of the driving factor of why we go to cities, etc. Here's my cynicism. One, there have always been multiple narratives about cities, but to your point, the number one narrative pro city was usually a GDP argument, etc. So it feels a little bit like people who love cities are saying, "Oh well, that GDP thing that we were saying, I guess." Forget that. We'll just talk about we just like cities better. So it feels a little it feels a little bit like the big argument was just shot down in a lot of ways, and so people are skipping to the next argument. But it feels a little bit rich, from a debate perspective, to put all your eggs in the GDP bet, or a lot of them, and then be like, "Oh no, we just like opera houses," right? So that's cynicism one. Cynicism two, which might be even darker, is look, Instagram is pretty awesome. It is true, and VR is pretty fun. And it is true that historically we're social creatures, and virtual environments and narcissistic single player games against AI or whatever, we're not even close. You're not going to play Space Invaders all day long versus talking to you, Eran. But as technology gets more sophisticated, actually playing by ourselves / playing in our own universes against AIs in the metaverse or whatever it's going to be, it's pretty darn compelling. Right. And is competitive with reality. So one of the things I kind of think about is I actually feel in a lot of ways, one of the big meta narratives is in history right now is no one's ever really had a legitimate challenge to reality. We all had to live in it. And so there are certain ways you had to live in it that made sense. But I actually do believe that technology is super fun, and we've invented a set of new tools which fundamentally challenge how much fun reality is. Reality now has to compete for attention, right, in a way that it never did before. And so I do wonder, the cynical version of the world is yeah. Well, basically what you said is there was a GDP argument. It turns out not to be true. Now you're saying there's a social ability, fun, human argument for it. But actually you're just not looking big enough picture, and that's going to turn out to be not true either.
I tend to agree with you. I don't think it's cynical at all. I think we're just old, so we are theorizing about it. But if you'll ask my son, he wouldn't understand us even arguing about it, right? He's spending 3 hours a day with his friends socializing on the computer. and and their games, and the games is just the context. They're actually socializing. You can hear them kind of talking, and he's done that throughout the months of that we spent in Greece. He's spending more time with his friends than I ever spent with my friend in the physical world, in the real world, and he's not bothered by, once every few weeks they go out and eat hamburgers together, but it's not something that he craves for because he's satisfied and he's actually cruising through this whole COVID thing. So
Yeah.
I think that.
So I guess that's kind of my point. Is then why are we arguing that cities are going to survive? Why won't we all end up just kind of saying, okay, well, we need enough infrastructure. There needs to be enough density that Amazon can work fast, right? There is still physical logistics that matter in the world. But actually, the Opera House argument is not correct, right? And neither is sports teams, because the reality is like these digital engagements and digital socialization is very viable and actually better in a lot of cases.
Yeah, but you need to play that argument to its end, right? Like at the end of the day, one of the things that I always give as an example of why networks are better than hierarchies is the food scene in the 80s in New York and Moscow. And I say, in Moscow, you had organized kind of hierarchical structure and people stood in line to get one type of bread. And in New York, no one promised you that tomorrow you'll have bread, but you actually have a dozen different kinds to pick in the bakery that is like 2 minutes walk from your house, right? That was the scene because there was enough of demand, enough density. Now, if you're living in Jackson Hole and you're like, there's like 5,000 people there, okay? The amount of, at the end of the day, of services and products that you can consume that will make sense from a market perspective to deliver to you is gonna, it's gonna be smaller than what you can get in San Francisco. That's just an economic kind of argument.
Maybe. I mean, the question, maybe. The question is a few fold. Like, one is like, what does the logistics picture look like, right? Meaning, and like, what, the
Amazon
reason
and stuff.
Yeah, and then also like, it's not like you're saying there's not a global taste market, right? Like all of us, what the difference between Moscow and New York in the 80s and today is like, look, you were in Moscow in the 80s, the hierarchical system, you only thought there was one type of bread. You know what I mean? Like, you're gonna be able to sit in Jackson Hole and say, oh, like that shit looks good in New York. Get me some of that. And maybe it's a little more expensive, right? Like, or maybe it's a day later, but it's like when you're eating sushi in San Francisco, that was caught in Japan, one night earlier. Now, again, we're talking about very high class problems. Like this is not the way, but it's not clear to me that if information flows super freely and just logistical costs come down over time, and socialization, there are things I really worry about, like diversity. Right. Like the reality is like what we're setting ourselves up for is a very undiverse world of pockets. Right. Because all of a sudden, if I can talk to my friends all day long, all the time, I'd rather talk to my friends than meet some random new person. So there's no incentive, right? Or no, I'm not forced to engage with a diverse landscape.
I'm not sure I'm buying that so much because the internet has proved itself as a place that build discovery engines to find new people and new experiences better than the real world. The serendipity that
certainly more extreme experiences. Like I think this is actually is like I can imagine. Like there's no question the internet initially made it easy to find your friends who also liked Warhammer or knitting or whatever that you couldn't find in a mall in America, right? No question.
Yeah.
I actually think it's gone a step further and is now pushing people to much further extremes, right? So it's not like being the best at knitting is no longer a thing. It's way too big a world, right? You have to be the best at knitting kittens on a purple sweater and, like very super micro communities. The question is, once you find those, are they transitive? Do they rejigger a lot, or do they get, you're like, look, you have your 10 friends, right? You have your 20 friends. They're always there, so why make new friends?
I'll tell you where my personal experience is different. I've got really hooked into TikTok in the last year, like everyone else. I actually kind of, yes, I used it many years ago when it was Musical.ly, but that was kind of as a product manager kind of exploring. now I'm really hooked. And why am I hooked to it? It's because it's the ultimate tool for empathy, from my perspective. I can get into TikTok and I can see the life of a girl in Tibet or a young boy in Africa, or someone doing pranks on his wife. But I can get a window into other
Yeah.
people, and yes, sometimes it's staged, but many times it's authentic, and it's a tool
Is it empathy or voyeurism? Because I love it too. And it's funny. I mean, my experience of it is I guess less up. I mean, it's both uplifting and not. And this is a funny conversation to end on, point to end on. But it's like, on one hand, I'm with you. I mean, I think TikTok was this breath of new content and diversity. When I was, my Instagram feed has become 100% optimized for me, which is basically girls surfing and skiing, right? And I love it. It's like all the things I actually want to look at, right? TikTok, introduced me to all these new weird worlds that I would never have actually sought out, but like it kind of serendipitously brings you into. The question is like, is the enjoyment, is it empathy or is it voyeurism? And then even there, like once
know.
it knows
That's
you,
probably.
yeah.
I think it's probably the difference between our character, right? Like what we gravitate to. No, joking. But what the only point I want to make is that I never kind of bet against kind of human ingenuity, right? Like we didn't kind of a few years ago, we didn't predict that we'll have that experience that we are having now, right? So I don't know what's going to happen when everyone will have a Quest 2 or Quest 3 or whatever, and there will be new platforms that will be built. But I'll tell you, when we go back to cities or to, I would say, living, when I was kind of walking through these Greek islands, the thing that came to me, because we're entrepreneurs, so we look at opportunities wherever we find them. Like, why the hell someone didn't build something like a We Live in some Greek island, right? Bring everyone that can work remotely.
People
I
pitched
was
it.
Walking. Really?
I've seen many pitches for that. And these these communities of 20 somethings that have, travel around the world. And it's like, it's exactly that. It's we live in better places.
Right. So if that's taking it to the ultimate, and then there's questions of residency and taxes and all kinds of interesting questions come to it. So we could get into more mixing of societies and cultures and people in general through that.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it'll become more stratified because globally the elite will disconnect and everyone will have their 10 friends. It's the cynicism. It just depends how you look at it. But I'm with you. Anyway, so let's wrap up because we've been going for 45 minutes and this has been great as always. It is, Eran. But when you go back to the topic we started on, it's just transportation, and like the future of it. I just like, I'm curious, like maybe to put a fine point on it. Does COVID change your analysis? Or do you think it's kind of not necessarily in terms of exactly how it plays out, but like your meta narrative of how self-driving and density, it sounds to me like it does. But I'm curious if you feel like your narrative has shifted over the years, or if it's kind of more playing out, along lines you'd expect.
Well, it has. First of all, I was always kind of, it's gonna take a while for something that focus on that we have today. And the thing that I've been focused way more on is what I call real world applications, and the city and transportation all as a platform for new services and new applications that are based on the technology that developed. And I think that for me is the most exciting thing that happens both in city life and transportation, also in other areas, because what you're starting to see, you're starting to ask yourself, okay, what is the next platform? What is the next app store? At the end of the day, we know that this format, the phone that we have in our pockets, is a winning format. it's going to take a long time for it to be replaced by a chip that is embedded in our brain. And I would venture that there isn't too much in between that is multi-scale, that is kind of not like something like that, a VR that is kind of nice for certain, but for everyone. So I'm asking, what is the next platform? And for me, the next platform that most interesting is actually the real world. It's asking, okay, how can I build new applications, new services, and turn the real world from something that I live in into something that I manage, I control, I program, I kind of mold. And we now are starting to have that capability as a species of continuously monitoring and measuring every aspect of reality and starting to manage it. And that's true in cities, it's true in agriculture, it's in different space. And for me, that is the most exciting, interesting kind of a trend for the next decade.
Cool, man. It's always great catching up with you, Eran. I love it. I always love your thinking. It always pushes in new directions. I hope to see you not virtually at some point, but I'm glad that, I mean, we can catch up meaningfully virtually and kind of do these sessions, even if it can't be in my basement in San Francisco.
Totally.
Good to see you, man. Have a nice evening. Good night.
You too. Bye-bye.